Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the first webinar in 2013 of the phone seminar series on green chemistry, brought to you by the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network and the Michigan Green Chemistry Clearinghouse. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Elise Miller, the Director and Co-Founder of the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. The Collaborative, based in California, is an international partnership of researchers, health professionals, and environmental health and justice advocates working to mitigate environmental contributors to chronic disease and disability. Ms. Miller has a master's in education from Harvard University and is actively associated with a number of organizations and initiatives that are focused around environmental health, including the Science and Environmental Health Network, the Endocrine Disruptor Exchange, the National Advisory Board of the Children's Environmental Health Network, the US EPA's Children Health Protection Advisory Committee, amongst others. Today, Ms. Miller will be discussing learning and developmental disabilities and delays and the role of green chemistry in helping to reduce these rates. The floor is now yours, Elise.
Well, excuse me. Thank you so much, Clinton. This is a real privilege to have this opportunity and delight to be here. And heartfelt thanks to Lynn for inviting me. I'm really sorry she can't be here as well. And she does an extraordinary job organizing these webinars. And I really appreciate your stepping in and your technological prowess, which has already been very helpful. So before I begin, I want to make it clear that I am neither a specialist in learning and developmental disabilities nor in green chemistry. But what I hope to convey is how these seemingly distinct arenas are in fact connected. And not only that, I want to suggest or even argue that green chemistry has the potential to help reduce the rising rates of learning and developmental disabilities and delays. In my talk, I will first provide a context for the broader concerns around environmental health. Then I'll offer some statistics on learning and developmental disabilities. Next, we'll take a look at the science behind the chemical contributors associated with learning and developmental disabilities. Then we'll review some of the economic implications. And finally, I'll talk about green chemistry as a means for implementing the precautionary principle, which I think can in turn help children reach their full potential. Since I'm not sure about the level of expertise of those of you on this webinar, forgive me if this is old hat for some of you. And that said, I hope that regardless of how long you've been steeped in this field, what I offer will provide a useful narrative to add to our collective efforts towards creating a healthier world. So Clinton, next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide provides the context for our discussion today, and I think we all know that over the last century our world has changed tremendously. The human activity has changed so many aspects of our lives, including the spread of synthetic chemicals and the result of air pollution and water pollution, the pesticides used in our industrialized food supply, among other chemicals, destruction of our ecosystems. And of course, that in turn has changed how we live and eat and work and play and socialize. And that has meant that with our built environments, as they are in so many areas, we're in greater isolation, we've reduced opportunities for physical activity, and of course the growing income gap continues to exacerbate some of the other factors that contribute to health or illness. Next slide, please. And though we, excuse me, I'm getting over a little bit of a flu, so apologize for my voice. Though we're concerned primarily with the chemical contaminants, it seems important to remind ourselves of the multi-layered interacting factors that can undermine our health or in turn enhance our health depending on how those factors express themselves in our lives. And these are multiple and complex, and it's hard to tease them apart at times. Heredity, gene-environment interactions, exposure to toxic chemicals, which we'll focus on today, nutrition and food, infectious disease, socioeconomic status, psychosocial environment, access to nature. These are all intertwined, and again, it's just important to know that there are many, many contributors in ways that are quite complex and ones that we want to continue to try to articulate and tease apart as best we can. Next slide, please. And so it's also important to remember that early life exposures are implicated in some later life diseases and disabilities. And though we're focused on learning and developmental disabilities today, which would be more on the early end of the spectrum, some of the same chemicals that I'll discuss in more detail can also, or have been associated with some neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and dementia. So I think it's important to know that aging actually begins at conception and is really this lifelong pattern, and exposures at any time can also have implications for health. Next slide, please. So let's look at some trends in terms of childhood diseases and disabilities. The Pesticide Action Network kindly let me borrow this slide based on their recent report on the impact of pesticides on children's health. And you'll see here that the statistics show steady increases in many childhood diseases and disabilities over the past 30 years. You'll see obesity increasing by 171%, childhood cancers, the incidence has increased by 25%. And we'll get into more detail about the learning and developmental disabilities. But it's quite remarkable to look at a graph like this and see that despite our seeming excellent healthcare system that we pride ourselves on, we are clearly not addressing the concerns of these rising diseases and disabilities. Next slide, please. So let's look a little more closely at the statistics regarding learning and developmental disabilities. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, reports that approximately 1 in 6 children under the age of 18 have some form of learning or developmental disability in the U.S. ADHD has increased 6.3 to 9.5% in this 13-year period between 1997 and 2010 for children's ages 5 to 11. That's within the Environmental Protection Agency's report that just came out last week. It was the revised 3rd edition of the America's Children in the Environment report. Autism, the CDC has reported now that 1 in 88 children have autism or on the autism spectrum disorder spectrum, sorry, and that's been a 10-fold increase over the last 40 years. Intellectual disabilities is about 2% and hasn't changed much. That's more in sort of a steady state. And we can talk further later about how much is this regarding how things are diagnosed, how symptoms are diagnosed, and how much is truly because of increases. So we can get into that in a moment. And here I also added mental health concerns for a couple of reasons. First, it's even more prevalent than learning and developmental disabilities in children. And it's just extraordinary that 1 in 5 children under the age of 18 currently have or have had a serious debilitating mental illness. That's from the National Institute of Mental Health. That's an extraordinary statistic. And since mental illness is primarily a neurological disorder coupled with other factors like stress and trauma, any chemical that might impact the neurological system and lead to a learning disability might also contribute to a mental illness. And the scientific literature on this is growing. And in fact, earlier this month, I attended a meeting of the Northern California Association of Child and Adolescent Psychiatrists, which perhaps for the first time of any meeting of psychiatrists in this country had a focus on toxic chemicals and other stressors that could impact mental health. So I think that's a major development and important to note. Next slide, please. Now this slide is one that many of you have seen in a variety of forms, essentially showing that children are not little adults, but in fact are more vulnerable to exposures, particularly at certain developmental windows than adults. Prenatally, the placenta does not protect the fetus from exposures to various toxic chemicals, and of course, developmental windows are so important when different biological systems in the body are coming to fruition at certain periods during pregnancy, and it really depends on when that exposure happens as to what part of the biological system it might impact. Postnatally, again, this has been well stated by many, many other people. Pound per pound, children eat, drink, and breathe far more than adults. They have an increased metabolic rate. They're on the floor. They're putting things in their mouths. This is, a major source of exposure. And also, they are exposed through breast milk. And, of course, I always emphasize that it's still best to breastfeed. But just the fact, and to me, is really a human rights concern that breast milk now contains so many contaminants that are passed on to the infant. Next slide, please. Again, the focus of this slide is likely well known to all of you. Even the cashier at my local grocery store knows what endocrine-disrupting chemicals are now. But it seems important to remind ourselves why these chemicals are so concerning. And you'll see in the graph in a non-monotonic dose response curve, and this is from the ourstolenfuture.org website, the shape of the dose response curve reverses as the level of contamination goes up. So some of these non-monotonic dose response curves are shaped like U's with high responses at low and at high levels of contamination. And others are shaped like inverted U's with the greatest response in intermediate ranges. So it's an intriguing observation that low doses may actually cause greater impact than high doses for a specific response. Next slide, please. So in epigenetics, I think this is very, very new science and certainly for me as well. It's a study about how environmental factors alter the way our genes are expressed. And just last week, there was a study published in Science magazine showing for the first time a possible mechanism by which epigenetics occurs. And Jamie Hackett, who's a lead author, and his colleagues found that some rare methylation, and methylation is the biochemical process that one of several different mechanisms that cells use to control gene expression. Well, that methylation can escape the reprogramming process and thus be passed on to the offspring. And this reveals how the epigenetic inheritance could occur. And so this is a very exciting insight. And the paper states that this is important because aberrant methylation could accumulate at genes during a lifetime in response to environmental factors such as chemical exposure or nutrition, and can cause abnormal use of genes leading to disease. If these marks are then inherited by offspring, their genes can also be affected. So in terms of epigenetic issues specific to today's topic, I'd like to note the publication of a review on the science of epigenetic impacts on neurodevelopment, published in the Journal of Pediatric Research in 2011. The researchers noted that disruptions of genes are known to cause several intellectual developmental disability syndromes, and other recent work has highlighted genes with epigenetic functions as being implicated in autism spectrum disorders and schizophrenia. In other words, the literature they summarize indicates that the gene-environment interaction is an important factor of pathogenicity for neurodevelopmental disease and disabilities. It's also important to note that some of the emerging scientific studies suggest that there can be transgenerational epigenetics impacts. According to some leading researchers in this area, Bruce Blumberg, Michael Skinner, Randy Girdle, others, this means that the third generation, and even possibly the fourth, can inherit the abnormal expression of certain genes, possibly due to a chemical exposure that say the grandmother has experienced, but to which her grandkids were not exposed. But they still experience the same epigenetic impact in terms of their health and neurodevelopment. So this is just an animal model to date. Mostly they've just been looking at obesity and reproductive health issues, not as much on neurotoxicants, but early indications are definitely another cause for concern about these exposures. So next slide, please. So now I want to move into a relatively brief overview of some neurotoxicants that are associated with learning and developmental disabilities. And I borrowed this slide from the program on reproductive health and the environment at the University of California, San Francisco, run by Tracy Woodruff, who many of you may know, and shows the body burdens of many chemicals that these pregnant women carry. And you'll see organophosphate pesticides, organochlorine pesticides, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, a number of heavy metals, and so forth. And it's just really remarkable, again, that the women who were tested in this had all these different chemicals during their pregnancy. And, of course, as I mentioned before, the fetus isn't necessarily protected from those exposures. So next slide, please. And indeed, many of those chemicals, plus other ones on this list, are some of the chemicals known to be associated with learning and developmental disabilities. And I recommend a report of the Scientific Consensus Statement on Environmental Agents associated with neurological disorders that CHE, the Collaborative on Health and the Environment, my organization, published in 2008 with lead author Steve Gilbert. And it lists many more chemicals and provides an analysis based on the peer-reviewed literature. And we're hoping to update that soon when time becomes available, which we're not sure about when that is. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to review a few specific neurotoxicants. And because it's been so heavily researched, lead is most often used as an example. So this slide essentially shows that what we thought was a threshold that was safe in terms of exposure, and below which an exposure was not going to cause any kind of harm, well, that exposure level, or threshold rather, has gone down and down and down over the decades as the science has become more sophisticated. And now epidemiologists generally agree that there is, in fact, no safe level to be exposed to lead, and that it can impact neurological function even in minute doses. So the challenge is, even though lead has been banned from products in this country, because of global markets, a lot of consumer products that we've heard about recently, like children's toys and jewelry, have ended up, in this country, in the marketplace and in children's hands. And so certainly, kids are still being exposed to lead, and certainly in many countries around the world. And it continues in this country, regardless of the imports. And the people most impacted, of course, and this is an environmental justice issue, live in lower income neighborhoods where the housing stock is from the 1970s or older and contain lead paint. And according to one study, about 36% of inner city African American kids are still exposed to lead. So the story of methylmercury exposure is very similar to lead, in that what was considered a safe level of exposure has dropped and dropped as we have realized how potent a neurotoxicant it is. But we haven't banned the use of methylmercury, and it's fused from coal-burning power plants around the world, and certainly in our country, and ends up in the water, contaminating many of the different species of fish that are often eaten and found on the marketplace. Next slide, please. So another neurotoxicant I will mention is the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. And this study was published in Pediatrics in August 2009, and Frederica Pereira, who's at Columbia University's Center for Children's Environmental Health, was the lead author on it. The study was of children and non-smoking Black or Dominican American women residing in New York City. And they were monitored from in utero to 5 years of age, the kids were, with determination of prenatal PAH exposure through personal air monitoring for the mothers during pregnancy. And at age 5, the intelligence for these children, there were 249 children, was assessed. And the results provided the first evidence that environmental PAHs at levels encountered in New York City can affect children's IQ adversely. Next slide, please. Another example of a neurotoxicant is polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. PCBs are a group of organochlorides that were widely used in coolant fluids for transformers and electric motors and other products like that. When it was determined to be a persistent organic pollutant, PCB production was banned in 1979 in the U.S. and by the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants in 2001. But the challenge is, because PCBs are persistent and bioaccumulative, we all have them in our bodies. And PCBs can affect the functioning of the all-important thyroid, which influences how the neurological system develops. So in this slide, you'll see depiction of summarizing studies that have shown that if the thyroid hormone is disrupted by a chemical like PCBs and goes lower during pregnancy, particularly during the first 3 months of pregnancy, then that impacts the fetus's thyroid hormone, which also goes lower. And in turn, in response, the thyroid stimulating hormone becomes overactive in the mom and the fetus, and that can impact brain development in the offspring. And during this one study showed that it was associated with IQ, reduced IQ at ages 7 and 9 years. Next slide, please. And a final neurotoxicant I'll mention, and I can talk about many others, but just for today's conversation, I'll simply mention bisphenol A. And BPA is the building block for the polycarbonate plastic, which is the hard, clear plastic that we have in many products. It's also found in the epoxy resin that lines cans used for food and beverages, and in dental sealants. And it's ubiquitous. It's in detectable levels in more than 90% of the U.S. population. So relevant to our discussion today, I won't talk about cardiovascular or insulin resistance, but looking at the cerebellar neurons during development, and the cerebellum, just to explain a little more detail, is a region of the brain that plays an important role in motor control, and it's also involved in some cognitive functions like attention and language. And because it concerns, about exposure to BPA, there have been studies that have shown that indeed it is a neurotoxicant and something to be quite concerned about. Unfortunately, however, BPA was recently replaced with a supposedly less toxic chemical, bisphenol S, and BPS. There was a report that just came out a couple days ago from the University of Texas, and they, Cheryl Watson and some of her colleagues at the University of Texas, linked the low concentrations of BPS to disruption of estrogen, spurring concern that it might cause human health problems. And the researchers exposed rat cells to levels of BPS that are within the range people are exposed to, and just like BPA, the compound interfered with how the cells responded to natural hormones, which are, of course, vital for reproduction and other biological functions. So that's another whole conversation to have is, about safer alternatives. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned at the beginning, cumulative stressors are also extremely important when we think about these issues. And if single exposures weren't enough, we really need to consider the additive or synergistic effects of cumulative stressors, since none of us are exposed to just one chemical at a time anyway. I point out here a study that appeared in Toxicological Sciences, published in 2003, indicated developmental and neurobehavioral effects of gestational and lactational exposure to a mixture of 14 of the PCBs and 11 organochlorine pesticides, and then they compared that against just exposure to a PCB mixture. Well, the PCB plus organochlorine pesticide mixtures affected significantly more mortality, growth, thyroid function, and neurobehavior development in rodents. So that was just suggesting that there can be synergistic, additive or synergistic effects. And I'll just briefly mention bringing the other non-chemical stressors into the mix. And I'd like to point out Deborah Corey-Slechta's study that was published in the Journal of Toxicological Science in 2010. And she and her team were looking at lead plus stress. And what she found was that there were enhanced learning deficits in female rats following a lifetime exposure to lead combined with prenatal stress. So again, we also need to take in consideration these other factors. Next slide, please. So what are the environmentally attributable costs of these exposures for pediatric diseases and disabilities? Well, this chart here was one of the first to put a dollar amount to the environmentally attributable factors associated, or fraction associated with these particular health endpoints. And the results suggest that we could save billions of dollars if we were to reduce or eliminate the environmental contributors. Now, these studies it was based on a number of assumptions. They had a number of experts in National Academy of Sciences and elsewhere helping to figure out what the algorithms were for making these decisions about, and they were very conservative in their estimates. And since this study was done, many others have been calculated for specific states, including Michigan, and for other particular diseases. And I'll just mention that on a global level, the calculation was done by the United Nations for the global health cost of using pesticides. And the UN reported that potential cost of pesticide-related illnesses in sub-Saharan Africa between 2005 and 2020, so this is a projection, could reach $90 billion. And this just highlights the growing health and environmental hazards, the concerns from the use of pesticides, and it turns out that the estimated cost of pesticide poisoning exceeds the total amount of international aid for basic health care services for that region, excluding HIV/AIDS. So that's a pretty extraordinary statistic unto itself. Next slide, please. So there's also been calculations done on the the economics of IQ, and in this country, how we value IQ is that the value of one IQ point is $14,500 is the median in terms of year 2000 dollars, and by reducing blood levels by 10 micrograms per deciliter actually raises IQ by 2.6 points. Which would equal $37,700 in a lifetime earnings per person. So, in other words, by reducing blood levels, raising IQ, the lifetime earnings of a person is going to increase. In terms of methylmercury, a cohort of children with methylmercury levels of 5 micrograms per liter, it was estimated that loss of economic productivity was $1.3 billion per year, and those were associated with emissions from American power plants. Finally, I'll just mention that special education costs, which continue to increase, are on average, and this was in 1999-2000, $12,474 per student, which is 2.28 times higher the cost of a regular student. So we're talking about lots of different kinds of costs, and plus the emotional costs, of course, to the families and the kids who are faced with these disabilities. Next slide, please. So in response to these concerns, a group of colleagues with the Environmental Health Fund, the Commonweal Biomonitoring Project, the Alaska Community Action on Toxics organization, several groups that spearheaded CHE's Learning and Developmental Disabilities Initiative, including the Learning Disabilities Association and the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, and the Autism Society, and the National Association for the Duly Diagnosed. All of these groups worked together to undertake a biomonitoring study in 2009. And the study was of 12 people affiliated with the learning and developmental disabilities sector, and they were tested for 14 different neurotoxic chemicals. And of those 14 chemicals, all the participants were found to have detectable body burdens of bisphenol A, perchlorate, mercury, lead, organochlorine pesticides, perfluorinated compounds, and polybrominated biphenyl ethers, or PBDEs. And of course, we cannot say that any of these chemicals caused the LDDs in some of the participants with an LDD or learning and developmental disability diagnosis. But it's the fact that so many neurotoxicants were found in all of them, and given the financial and emotional costs of these disabilities already, it's a powerful statement. And the results were written up in what our report, The Mind Disrupted, How Toxic Chemicals May Change How We Think and Who We Are. And we had a major media release around that, and project leaders organized a congressional briefing on chemical policy reform. Next slide, please. So in addition to what we can do in terms of educating policymakers, what else do we need to do in terms of making the systems changes that we need to alleviate and address some of these concerns that I've been describing? Well, first is really a fundamental shift in mindset. And what if we were to put optimal health in the center of every decision we had to make on the personal level and on the national level, whether we're at the grocery store or at a meeting of International Economic Council? And by implementing the precautionary principle, many people argue, as do I, is one way to make that kind of shift. And in the wing spread statement, which many of you all I'm sure have read, there's a whole list of principles by which to understand what it means to take action based on precaution. It's about exploring these alternatives, looking at where we place the burden of proof, setting these goals like putting health, protection of health in the center of those conversations, and bringing democracy and transparency to the decisions rather than the trade secrets that are made behind closed doors that often affect our health. Again, making those transparent in ways that could encourage health protection. Next slide, please. And green chemistry is really, in its essence, based on the precautionary principle. And as many of you know as well or better than I, green chemistry encourages the design of products and processes that minimize the use and generation of hazardous substances. And I really liked how Amy Cannon framed the student learning objectives, objectives on green chemistry when she spoke on one of these webinars last year. And she noted, it's these different pieces that upon graduation, this is what chemistry majors would have proficiency in, and they would understand the 12 principles of green chemistry, and they would understand the principles of toxicology and the molecular mechanisms of how chemicals affect human health and the environment. And they would have laboratory skills with the ability to recognize and assess and design greener alternative chemical products. And not listed on here was also about the application in terms of serving society in the professional capacity of scientists and professionals through the articulation, evaluation, employment of methods and chemicals that are benign for human health and the environment. And so next slide, please. So what if we thought about how green chemistry could be a strategic intervention in the economic political system that currently functions in our society? Danella Meadows, whom many of you all may know of or know or knew, she was a systems thinker, co-author of Limits to Growth in the late 1970s, and she developed a way of distilling the complexities of a system into these categories where an intervention could make a difference in a process or behavior. And these are the categories she came up with, not all of them, but these are some of the major ones. And you'll note here that the lower the number on this chart, the harder to do, but also the more effective the intervention can be. So starting at number 9, you can try to change subsidies and taxes, and then you're looking at trying to change material stocks and flows, and then it goes on down to rules of the system, and then into how to change the mindset. And so on the next slide, I wanted to think about green chemistry in this context. If we use green chemistry, how can it change the system, and in this context, minimize neurotoxicity and ultimately improve society? So if green chemistry were implemented broadly, it would make impact on materials and stocks, right? We would have less toxic chemicals in the marketplace, fewer stockpiles. It would drive positive feedback loops. The more chemicals designed based on the principles of green chemistry, the more those are used, the more people want them to be used because they feel healthier, the environment is as polluted. And so these are all positive feedback loops. Just jumping down here to another example, how green chemistry could change the rules of the system. It provided different kinds of parameters, a different scope about what's acceptable acceptable given the priority is optimal health. And it would also change the goals of the system regarding what is prioritized. Do we prioritize optimal health for everyone, or do we prioritize the bottom line? And again, it's really, shifting that hierarchy of priorities. And finally, if you're really looking at that fundamental shift, which I was talking about in terms of the cautionary principle, green chemistry could help in making that change in mindset and worldview and how we choose to use our resources and how we relate to others and the earth. And so, of course, we have a long, long way to go to get to number one. But in this context, it seems to me designing chemicals that minimize or eliminate neurotoxicity could very well lead to fewer learning developmental disabilities and delays. And I personally don't think that is a big leap to make. If anyone needs to be convinced that green chemistry is a really smart investment, then I suggest they sit in a special education class for about a week, and they might just get how, in that experience, how designing safer chemicals could mean that more of those kids, not all of them, but more of them, would have the potential to really flourish. And by doing that, our resiliency and capacity as society could be heightened. And now that's something I think we all would want to see in our lifetime and in our children's lifetime and in their children's lifetimes. Thank you very much. You can go to the next slide. And this is my son. This is part of the reason why I do this work. And I certainly welcome all of you to join the collaborative. It's certainly free of charge. You can participate on any of our conference calls and working groups and so forth. And you're certainly welcome to contact me as well. And I believe we now have some time for Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Elise. So we'll now open up for the Q&A session. We do have a couple of questions that have already been submitted, and I will start to read those out in a moment. One of the things that struck me in this presentation was the examples that you used around neurotoxicants and with known developmental effects and learning disability effects a lot of them were legacy chemicals. What things that have been in the environment for a long time and are still there due to being biopersistent, so the PCBs and the organochlorine molecules and lead. So I'm wondering if you could also speak to give us a sense of how many kind of newer chemicals that are coming on the market are also suspected that they're also contributing to learning disabilities. I mean, you pointed out bisphenol A as an example, but I'm kind of wondering how prevalent is this problem? So we can make the case using the legacy chemicals, but how prevalent do we think the problem is with new chemicals that are appearing in the market? And how does the system have to change so that we can capture those new chemicals and don't have to wait on 30 years of biomonitoring data?
Well, excellent questions. Unfortunately, we actually just don't know how the new chemicals that are coming on the market, and there are hundreds of new chemicals on the market every year, most of which, or almost all, certainly the majority of which, have never been tested for human health concerns, including neurotoxicity. So we're really working in a vacuum in terms of data gaps. We really just don't have the kind of information we need to make better choices, which is part of the reason why, for example, with BPA, we made a very poor choice by going ahead and saying, well, let's switch to BPS because we think it might be safer. But apparently, no one had done the kinds of studies that needed to be done before that kind of change was made. And I think we're really going to be very prone to doing that same thing over and over again with other chemicals, partly because we don't know a lot about the chemicals that are already on the marketplace. We do have some new high-throughput systems, TOX-21, that some of our government agencies are now have invested in. They have some, certainly some great value, but they also don't test chemicals in the human body, and we're exposed to hundreds of chemicals in any given day. And how that impacts any one individual is really hard to say, depending on so many other factors. So really, from my perspective, if we're going to, shift the system, how do we do that? I mean, that's why green chemistry, I think, is so important, because if we start making choices at the very inception of a chemicals design process, and we are already looking at potential human health impacts, we have a far less likelihood that we will design chemicals that will have those toxic impacts. And so I think the beauty of the green chemistry paradigm, maybe that's not quite the right word, but that the way it prioritizes health can very easily put us in a much better trajectory in terms of, from the get-go, knowing that what we put out in the marketplace don't have these neurotoxic or other effects that we see. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And while you were answering that, we did receive a question in the same vein. It was basically that, given what happened with the BPA example, what lessons can we learn from this? And I think you have addressed that. I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to add in addition to that question.
No, I think we do need to get better at testing the chemicals that are on the marketplace, and because some of them are bioaccumulative and persistent, we really need to ban the use of those chemicals so that we can get them out of our environment as quickly as possible, the ones we already know are neurotoxic.
Yeah. All right, so the next question we have is there a move towards making the chemical manufacturers more responsible and having to shoulder the burden of proof as far as possible adverse effects on human health?
Well, there are a number of groups and a number of our colleagues who are very invested in working on market changes and really going to the corporations or even both the manufacturers, but also those box stores like Kmart and Walmart and others who sell the products, and saying, well, here's the science. You really don't want to put these chemicals in baby bottles, do you? That's probably not a good public relations thing. And let's work together. Let's come up, what are some alternatives? How can we make greener chemicals? And so I think there is a real, I don't know if we call it a movement yet. There are a lot of people on the move, in terms of our circles of colleagues trying to make these changes. There has been some dramatic decisions by major corporations to no longer use certain chemicals in the cosmetics industry. There's been some real changes, not having bisphenol A in baby bottles. So there has been some changes, but still, there's a long ways to go. And I think we need to build on the success of those efforts.
I'll just make a little comment here. We do have lots of questions, and this may come up as an issue as we go along. But this word burden of proof, the precautionary principle calls for, basically says, the uncertainty factor is really the sticking point. How certain do we have to be that a certain chemical causes a certain effect before we will do something about it? And so I think that tends to be sticking points. Again, I think the burden of proof is kind of on both sides. It's it's not only who shoulders the burden of proof, but what is the sufficient burden of proof.
Right, and that is delicate, but there are qualities such as bioaccumulative or persistent of chemicals that we already know we don't want. So there are certain, characteristics of these chemicals that we can look for and say, well, that's probably not good because it's going to stay in our environment for a long, long time, and we know it's used to kill these bugs with a neurotoxic agent. Maybe there's something else we could use instead. So I'm sort of simplifying it, but I think there are some characteristics, and that's partly, again, where green chemistry can come in and helping us to evaluate and assess what kinds of characteristics the current chemicals and then future chemicals have, and hopefully choose to make those that are more benign.
Yeah. We have a lot of, I'm going to just jump ahead to another question, so I'm going out of order quickly because I think this kind of relates to what we're just talking about. It's, this idea of the burden of proof being on the manufacturer. So I think this is a related question. Is there a cumulative effort, and maybe the word could also be collaborative effort, to encourage or support a wider spread usage of predictive toxicology?
What was the last?
Of predictive toxicology.
Predictive toxicology, right. Well, again, you know, in my work, I mean, what we try to do is bring attention to the emerging science and to get as many constituencies educated and involved and knowledgeable about engaging whomever it is, whether it's in the marketplace or with policymakers, to have the information they need to educate others that in order to move towards these kind of changes. And so, you know, again, I really see, and I think there are a number of colleagues who have worked hard with the media, for example, and helping to educate journalists about these issues. And I think more and more the press and the mainstream media has helped to bring attention to these issues as well. So I think all of these different efforts are playing a role, and I think we're trying as much as possible to keep abreast of what other organizations are doing, so that we can each, you know, continue to push on our particular piece, but in collaboration with the others.
Okay, so moving on to the epigenetic question. The question goes, you know, are the epigenetic studies currently all at the animal model level? The questioner in particular is thinking about female offspring, since female fetuses have all the eggs they will be born with. So if the pregnant woman had the exposures, the offspring may have their own offspring affected a generation later. Is this indeed what is being studied?
Right. So as far as I know, and someone on this call may be able to correct me, I think they are all been rodent models or animal models for studying epigenetics to date. So that's what to my knowledge. In terms of how what they're studying, and again, I'm not an epigeneticist. This essentially, if the grandmother is exposed to a certain chemical, and the grandchild, offspring, they make sure it's controlled to not be exposed at all. Then they're trying to see, well, why are they having this health condition if they haven't been exposed to that chemical, and why, you know, why is their DNA being expressed in this way when it shouldn't have been triggered in the grandchildren, in the third generation. So again, I'm not probably the best person to explain that process clearly. There's a lot more information online these days on epigenetics, and I'd be happy to get more information if that would be useful.
Thank you. So we have a series of questions now that are kind of related to, I think there's a lot of interest in this model you proposed around, you know, the system and, you know, the 9 areas or tiers, and we can change the system. So I'm going to read out a couple that are related to that. So the first one is, let me see, I'm just getting out of order here a little bit. So the one question says, green chemistry is all about designing out inherent hazards in chemicals, but the regulatory system is based on exposure control. What is your opinion, what in your opinion is crucial to change this focus from exposure control to inherent hazards in the phase out of these chemicals?
Well, I believe and there needs to be a hazard-based assessment of chemicals, that it can't just be exposure-based. So that's a very short answer to that question.
Okay. Staying the same vein about the system, I think this is particularly like this question. I think it says, is the chemical industry an active participant in establishing the rules of the system you describe? And I would just like to kind of paraphrase that question, because it struck me, you know, as we try to change the system, one of the problems is who's setting the rules for the system.
Right. Well, we're all in the system. So.
But whose rules are we playing by?
Right. And right now we're mostly, in my opinion, playing by the rules of those who have the often have the greatest amount of money, who can you know, lobby for the priorities that they see are most important. And so I think there are a lot of very big challenges. We can go on into campaign finance reform if we really want to look at, systemic problems. So to make these kinds of changes, it really does take this kind of deep shift in mindset, and that's why, again, I keep coming back to green chemistry, and it's not just for purposes of this call. It really has that potential to shift how everything else is done down the line. Because if you start with a very different premise and with a very different principle, then you're going to make different choices all the way down the line. But of course, to shift, one person can shift their mindset, and it's not going to make any difference. And so, where's that 100th monkey or that tipping point where enough people say, this isn't working? And I think we certainly haven't reached that yet. But we are going to have to if we're also going to work with all the other players in the system who need to say, yes, I think we should have optimal health at the center of our conversations.
Okay, we now have a series of questions. I think they're best grouped around the idea of, the life cycle of a chemical and who's being exposed. So the one question asks you kind of generally talk about green chemistry and the issue of, cradle to grave exposure, all the various people that are being exposed, whether it's the workers, whether it's children at the end of life of the products. So that's kind of a general question to talk about that in general. But in the same vein, was a more specific question about, do you have the support of labor organizations, considering that the workers are the ones that are disproportionately affected? And there's also even a question about, what about, I think I'm understanding this, the issue of, the question goes, but who will pay the autistic coordinators and other immediately connected persons in the educational perspective? I don't quite understand the question, but I think it gets to this whole idea of the ripple effects that this has throughout the whole system and who ultimately is affected.
Right. Well, just to get to sort of the first broader question, absolutely, we're affected in so many different ways depending on our occupation and where we live, all those kinds of factors. And fortunately, a number of the labor unions are involved. Obviously, if we protected workers, we would also, protect a lot of other people. And there's what's called the Blue-Green Alliance, which is doing a great deal of work with labor on these issues. And I recommend you're, going to their website and just Google Blue-Green Alliance. I think there are a lot of, ripple effects and in education, and you start seeing the connections between all the different concerns we have, and that's why I kind of brought up the contextual picture of looking at everything from poverty to infectious disease. I mean, there are obviously other factors that are going to influence health, and we can start to get too diffuse, and clearly we have to have a focus if we're going to make a change. And I think starting with something, the chemical contaminant focus, and then moving to, a redesign of how we do chemicals from the get-go has a great deal of promise.
Okay, well, we don't have any more questions in, and I think that is perfect timing. We're almost up on the hour here, and I think the sampling of questions we have touched on a number of different areas, and thanks very much for answering those so well for us. And I think with that, we'll call it a wrap today.
Well, thank you so much, Clinton. This has really been a delight. I hope it's useful.
All right, thank you, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.